Good evening and welcome to another midweek study. This is midweek study number 8, and we are continuing our series, The Tradition of Election Sermons, tonight. So glad you're joining us and watching us, or whenever you're watching this. Glad that you are doing that. And as you saw in our little intro there, Bradford Christian College is the sponsor of this, and please, you'll find a link to their website in the description below. Please check them out and pass along information to others that could benefit from Bradford Christian College. Certainly, if it's something that you're looking at as far as earning a bachelor's degree or even a Master of Theological Studies degree, um, please contact Bradford Christian College with questions. See if it's not um, right choice for you. Okay, so we're going to dive into our election sermons. If you've been following, if you haven't been following, Bradford Christian College YouTube channel, go to the playlist, look for midweek study, and you can catch up on all that we've looked at so far. Um, as far as the tradition of election sermons, we completed a 1756 election sermon by Reverend Samuel Cooper. Um, and the interesting thing about that election sermon, well, there's many interesting things about it, but one interesting thing about that election sermon is that that was the year, I'm not exactly sure of the exact month or whatever that the French and Indian War started for the colonists, but that was the year in which that French and Indian War started. So there were a lot of tense issues in the colonies, and still they held their annual election sermon, and the local minister that's selected is preaching to the newly elected officers, and in this case, also to the governor who is appointed by the king, not locally elected, not elected locally by the people to serve in that position. Now, this is the conclusion of that sermon, and I've got highlighted here this kind of ending paragraph because I want us to remember this, and hopefully it'll take us a few episodes to get through the next election sermon we're going to look at. Um, Hopefully we'll remember to check back in on this conclusion here. And let me just read that conclusion. The faith of Moses, remember that this election sermon that we completed was really the Reverend Cooper um, using Moses as an example of the righteous lawgiver, legislator. He was looking at the characteristics of Moses and setting those forth as those are the characteristics that um, a a good legislator should have, a good political officer should have. And among the highest of those was the knowledge that in their ruling over the civil sphere, they have an accountability to God for how they rule. Okay, so the faith of Moses will point us to a better country. It will guide us to the only society where perfect devotion, benevolence, and happiness are found. To the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to an innumerable company of angels, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to God, the judge of all, to whom be dominion and glory forever. Okay, now, uh, so in his conclusion here, Reverend Cooper is suggesting that his topic or his focus on Moses and in particular the faith of Moses, uh, um, would point us to a better country. Okay, so a better country than presumably the one that in which they are currently living. Um, and that better country is the city of the living God. Now, the language here comes from, I would say, Revelation 21. Um, in terms of this great city, the holy Jerusalem descending out of heaven. I think that's where you get the heavenly Jerusalem. Um, and so he clearly is alluding to what we read at the end of or near the end of the book of Revelation. I want us to keep that in mind because I think that he's going to return to this idea in the next election sermon. And see, this is what's exciting about what we're doing here because we're now going to the year 1780. Same pastor, Samuel Cooper, another election sermon. This is 24 years later, but a lot's happened in 24 years. See, this sermon is preached on the commencement of the Constitution. It's a sermon preached before His Excellency John Hancock. Yes, that John Hancock, Esquire, Governor, the Honorable, the Senate and House of Representatives of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. October 25, 1780, being the day of the commencement of the Constitution and inauguration of the new government. Okay, so now let's think about our history, right? 1756, the colonies are engaged in the French and Indian War and they're fighting on behalf of the king. Okay. Now, 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence, right? Which declares that these colonies are free and independent states. Okay. Effectively, the colonies are each their own country, right? Now, um, they had a plan of uniting together, right? And being the states united in their effort to gain their independence. Um, so they weren't just cast off entirely on their own. But it did require that these now free and independent states establish a constitution. And Massachusetts worked long and hard, relatively long and hard, so that um, a full 4 years later, they finally have their state constitution in place. And so that's the event that brings Reverend Cooper back before the government of now the state of Massachusetts, no longer the colony, or I should say the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And he is going to present a sermon. And that's the sermon that we're going to go through. And so I think it will be quite interesting to try to remember our 1756 sermon from the same pastor, now 1780, under entirely different circumstances and yet similar circumstances. Here's his sermon. And his text is Jeremiah 30, verses 20 and 21. Their congregation shall be established before me, and their nobles shall be of themselves, and their governor shall proceed from the midst of them. Okay, now, I mean, if we just stop there, think about, if you know your history, think about um, one of the big issues among colonists, right? There was life, liberty, property and no taxation without representation. And what is this verse all about in terms of government, right? Nobles and governor. It's about representation, isn't it? It's about representation. Nobles shall be of themselves. The governor shall proceed from the midst of them. All right, let's see where he goes with this. Here we go. Nothing can be more applicable to the solemnity in which we are engaged than this passage of sacred writ. The prophecy seems to have been made for ourselves. It is so exactly descriptive of that important, that comprehensive, that essential civil blessing which kindles the luster and diffuses the joy of the present day. Okay, now I highlighted that statement there because um, if you read sermons or other writings, speeches of that time, just leading up to, immediately leading up to, during 1776 and just following it, we get many statements like this that the the used to be colonists, now free and independent citizens of states, seem to have this sense that the prophecies they read seem to have been made for them. Now, I want to get too crazy with that at all. I just want you to let's just pay attention, right? And we'll see in this pastor, I think, an example of the kind of thinking that had captured the minds of these people. And I bring this up for no other reason, well, maybe for other reasons, I don't know, but I bring it up for a singular reason that is to establish that what was being built through the war for independence and the constitutions that come out of that is rooted in Christianity without question. All right. Nor is this the only passage of Holy Scripture that holds up to our view a striking resemblance between our own circumstances and those of the ancient Israelites. You see, there's that connection again, right? And I'm telling you, right? Um, believe me now, or what is it? Hear me now, believe me later, or whatever. Anyway, fact check me. You cannot read the sermons of this period without seeing this sort of thing. And it actually does help confirm for us something that we need to have firmly established, that the governmental thinking was not as influenced by Rome and Greece as modern historians would make us think. What was most influential in the minds of, let's say, the founding father generation was what came to be called the Hebrew Republic, the circumstances of the ancient Israelites. Also, what they learned from Anglo-Saxon history, in terms of government as well. But in Anglo-Saxon history was really when they discovered the ancient Hebrew laws and implemented them there. So let's read on. A nation chosen by God, a theater for the display of some of the most astonishing dispensations of his providence. Now, all right, I want to be careful here, right? I don't want to charge or attribute too much or anything, but what's he talking about here? Right? What is he talking about? Is that his description of Israel, ancient Israel? Is he identifying the striking resemblance? Okay, I'll let you think about that. Okay. Um, I'm doing a quick search here of a particular quote. Let's see if the interwebs can help me with this. Right. So now this is 1780. Okay. In 1778, George Washington, who was, of course was the commander of the Continental Army, wrote a letter to Brigadier General Thomas Nelson Jr., August 20, 1778. And in that, Washington wrote this: the hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this, and he's referencing the Revolutionary War, the recent war, that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. Right? So Washington's saying, look, everybody here in these colonies now, free and independent states, if there's somebody living among us who went through that and with does not feel the obligation to be thankful to God for his hand of providence, the man's an infidel. He's more than wicked. And so when Cooper, I mean, I'm guessing Cooper doesn't want to be fall under that description as one who lacks faith and is more than wicked, right? So he's describing this striking resemblance, is what he's describing. This striking resemblance between our own circumstances, and he's talking about the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but he's talking about the bigger picture as well, the states united. Well, I think it's confirmed as we read on here. Let's see. Like that nation, we rose from oppression. I'm going to try to do some kind of color coding. I don't know. We rose from oppression and emerged from the house of bondage. Like that nation, we were led into a wilderness as a refuge from tyranny and a preparation for the enjoyment of our civil and religious rights. So, what Cooper is saying here is that what the colonies, or specifically Massachusetts, since he's dealing with the Constitution of Massachusetts, but applicable to every colony and now free and independent state that's been through this. Um, he's saying, just like, or in a similar way, as colonists, we found ourselves in Egypt, in bondage. And then we ended up in a wilderness, which would be a hard time, but was a preparatory time to end up for the enjoyment of our civil and religious rights. I mean, what he's talking about is a promised land. Now, I'm simply identifying what Reverend Cooper, who lived through this whole thing, remember, we just read his sermon from 1756. He lived through the 24 years up to 1780. And I think as we read this, you're going to be reading and seeing in this sermon a man who is overwhelmed with the new place he is finding himself in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Okay. And he's saying what we just went through has a striking resemblance to what ancient Israel went through. Like that nation, we've been pursued through the sea by the armed hand of power, which, but for the signal interpositions of heaven, the hand of providence, must before now have totally defeated the noble purpose of our emigration. Okay. So, yeah, I don't know that he ever saw why would he see the letter that Washington wrote to Brigadier General Thomas Nelson, right? But he is satisfying what Washington set down in that letter. He is fulfilling his obligation of gratitude to the God whose hand of providence. And to omit many other instances of similarity, like that nation, we have been ungrateful. Right. So here's what do we want to do here? These are some bad things. I don't want to trigger anybody, but I'll go red here. We've been ungrateful to the supreme ruler of the world and too lightly esteemed the rock of our salvation. 1780. What in the world? Right? It's been 4 years since they declared their independence. Now, the Revolutionary War is officially considered to have ended in 1783, although that's when the Treaty of Paris was signed. But effectively, it was ended October 1781. So here we are in 1780, and so there's still war going on, Revolutionary War going on. And Reverend Cooper is concerned. He's concerned about the people having fallen into a state of ungratefulness. Accordingly, he says, right? So the sermon, in a way, it starts off as a prayer, right? I mean, here he is, you might say, confessing the corporate sin of the people, right? We've been ungrateful, we've too lightly esteemed. Accordingly, we have been corrected by his justice, and at the same time, remarkably supported and defended by his mercy, so that we may discern our own picture in the figure of the ancient church divinely exhibited to Moses in vision, a bush burning and not consumed. This day, this memorable day, is a witness that the Lord, he whose hand makes great and gives strength unto all, has not forsaken us, nor our God forgotten us. This day, which forms a new era in our annals, exhibits a testimony to all the world that contrary to our deserts, and amidst all our troubles, the blessing promised in our text to the afflicted seed of Abraham is come upon us. Oops. I'm going to keep the right color scheme going here, I guess. The blessing promised in our text to the afflicted seed of Abraham has come upon us. Their nobles shall be of themselves, and their governor shall proceed from the midst of them. Okay, now, um, the thing that I want to emphasize right now in this first paragraph, I mean, look, when we read the sermon in 1756, we could say in the proper sense that that's not from America's history. It's from history that is marching towards America, but it's not yet American history. That's English history, British history, right? I mean, 1756, the colonies belong to Great Britain and they're subjects of the king, and they're clearly faithful subjects of the king, willing in difficult circumstances. And in fact, in circumstances that many of them probably thought this is why are we being dragged into this war that's between Great Britain and France over there? And if they were, and they, I mean, I'm going to say they, like each and every person was, faithful in this. I don't know that to be true, but apparently by and large, they were faithful in supporting the king in that. But see, here we get to really the country is 4 years old, right? And this is the heritage of this nation. Don't tell me that this is not a Christian nation. The people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have come together to both celebrate and be instructed in accordance with the um, establishment and now um, the taking effect of their new constitution. And they can't help but connect this with their Christian faith. This is all right. So look, when you encounter individuals that, oh, this isn't a Christian nation, this nation wasn't founded by Christians. I just want you to remember the first paragraph of the 1780 election sermon by Reverend Samuel Cooper in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as representative of all the states that came together. I mean, don't tell me it's not founded as a Christian nation. In fact, it is so much not that. The truth of the matter is it was very much founded a Christian nation. In fact, the people were certain that if the God of Christianity were not on their side and did not, by his hand of providence, bring things to this conclusion, they would have no nation. All right, continuing on. We'll never get through. We got a 19-page sermon here, so I better hold my commentary down. But this prophecy has an immediate respect to the deliverance of the Jews from the cruel oppressions of the king of Babylon. Okay, so now he's getting specifically to the text, right? He wowed us with this fascinating introduction where he says, yeah, this prophecy that I'm reading, it's like so much like what we went through. Let me just talk a little bit about how it's just so much the same. Ancient Israel, and just all right. So now he's going to get to the text itself and talk about what it means. Their sufferings, when they fell under the power of this haughty tyrant, as they are represented to us in sacred history, must harrow a bosom softened with the least degree of humanity. Okay. Yeah. See, we don't talk that way anymore, and it's to our shame, right? It's like we don't we don't we don't paint wonderful word pictures. Um, why did that work? Sorry. So a harrow is what you use to level plowed land, right? So um, you use whatever that's called that turns the soil, right? And then you're going to go over your land with the harrow. Oh, I guess a plow is what you use because it's plowed land. It's plowed land because a plow is right? Not a farmer. Anyway, a harrow is what you use to level that and break up the clods and even to cover over the seed that is sown, right? Um, and so in terms of breaking up clods of dirt, right? It's a tool that, in that sense, softens the soil, right? So that's what he's talking about here, right? Because he's saying if you're somebody with the least degree of humanity, right? The least degree of humanity, when you read about the sufferings of Israel under the Babylonian tyrant, uh, it must affect you. They give us a frightful picture of the effects of despotic power, guided and inflamed by those lusts of the human heart with which it is seldom unaccompanied. Do you see the sense of like a governmental analysis here, right? What do we know about the human heart? Well, it tends to be guided and inflamed by a lust. A lust for what? Well, maybe a lot of things, but certainly a lust for power. And when that human heart that is has a propensity to be guided and inflamed by lust for power finds itself in a tyrannical position, then it exercises despotic power in a very frightful way. Can we forbear weeping for human nature or blushing for its degradation when we view either the sufferer or the actor in such a scene? The relentless oppressor or those who are sore broken in the place of dragons, right? So he's saying um, it's sad all the way around. It's sad for those who are oppressed under the despot. It's sad for what it exposes in the human heart, from the human heart, the human nature, the actions of the one exercising despotic power. What can be more pathetic than the description of it given by the same prophet who gave the consolation in our text? How does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How has she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces. She weeps sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. She has none to comfort her. Her friends have dealt treacherously with her. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. She finds no rest. Her mighty men are trodden underfoot. Her young men are crushed. The young and the old lie on the ground in the streets. My eyes do fail with tears. My bowels are troubled. My liver is poured on the earth for the destruction of the daughter of my people. Now look at where he goes with this. Such are the fruits of lawless and despotic power in a mortal man intoxicated with it. Such desolations does it make in the earth, such havoc in the family of God, merely for the sake of enlarging its bounds and impressing its terror on the human bosom. It often, indeed, claims a divine original and impudently supports itself not barely on the permission, but the express designation of him whose tender mercies are over all his works. Okay, so what he's saying here when he's talking about that it claims a divine original, right? claims a divine original. Now notice what he's going to say. It exactly resembles the grand adversary of God and man, and is only a roaring lion that seeks whom he may devour. To plead a divine right for such a power is truly to teach the doctrine of devils. Now, granted, this pastor is giving this sermon in a particular setting, right? A political setting, you could say, right? I mean, there's a certain object in mind to celebrate the institution of their new constitution and to instruct and admonish those who are going to be the first, imagine, the first officers in political office for this free and independent state under this constitution. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, he may look at this verse and be very governmentally minded as he's considering this passage. Um, and yet, I don't think that I certainly don't think that means any misapplication of the passage. And it may well be the best application of the passage that he's drawing forth. It covets everything without bounds. It grasps everything without pity. It riots on the spoils of innocence and industry. It is proud to annihilate the rights of mankind, to destroy the fairest constitutions of wisdom, policy, and justice, the broadest sources of human happiness. Okay, so he's not painting a good picture. Oh, oops, I thought I was writing. He's not painting a good picture here of this despotic power that's being exercised. It enslaves the bodies, it debases the minds of the offspring of God. In its progress, it changes the very face of nature. It withers even the fruits of the earth and frustrates the bounties of our common parent. Before it is the garden of God, behind it is a desolate wilderness. Okay. I mean, is that a verse in the Bible? Is that directly from what we just read here? I don't remember reading that in here. It's in quotes. I wonder where that comes. Is that from the Bible? Like, I should have my whole Bible memorized, right? Um, I mean, that's powerful. I'm asking the interwebs here. I mean, in this short quote, um, our pastor is telling us everything we need to know about despotic power. Okay, so in the King James Version, Joel 2:3, a fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is as the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. All right, so um, yeah, that's his take on Joel 2:3. Wow, the Bible's got some good stuff in it. I mean, that no, that's an amazing word picture, isn't it? This is what tyranny does. This is what the unchecked rule of men with sinful hearts who grasp onto some power over a people. That's just what they do. Looking upon the Jews when groaning under such a power, their armies vanquished, the flower of their country cut off by the sword, their fortress reduced, their cities in ashes, their land ravaged, their temple and worship destroyed, and the remnant of the nation led in chains to a foreign land. Who would have thought that in a few years these cities and this temple should rise again from their ruins? and a people so totally enslaved and widely dispersed be restored to their rights and possessions, their laws and institutions, peace, liberty, and plenty daily augmenting their numbers and lighting up the face of joy through their whole land. While the haughty empire of Babylon, from which they had suffered so much, should set to rise no more. Okay, so should set like the sun sets at the end of the day. But in this case, we're thankful that the next morning comes and the sun rises. And, you know, I know science tells us that the sun is fixed and we're moving around it. Yet even a scientist would say, oh, the sun rose this morning, as though the sun is moving. Okay, just keep that in mind. But anyway, not Babylon. It will set in God's providence that the sun of that kingdom will set and rise no more. All right, so this is fascinating, right? This is a pastor that knows his history and is pointing out the can't think of a word I want to use, but these times in history where that which seems to have lost ends up winning, and that which looked like it is winning loses, right? Such, however, were the decrees of heaven, such the predictions of the inspired prophets, and such the event. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will break his yoke from off his neck and will burst his bonds, and strangers shall no more serve themselves of you. But you shall serve the Lord your God, and the city shall be builded upon her own heap, and they shall come and sing in the height of Zion, and fields shall be bought in this land whereof you say it is desolate. It is given into the hand of the Chaldeans. Men shall buy fields for money, and they that devour you shall be devoured, and they that spoil you shall be a spoil. And out of Judah shall proceed thanksgiving and the voice of them that make merry, and I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will also glorify them, and they shall not be small. Their children also shall be as aforetime, and their congregation, their religious and civil assemblies, shall be established before me, and I will punish all that oppress them, and their nobles shall be of themselves, and their governors shall proceed from the midst of them, and I will cause him to draw near, and he shall approach unto me. So now our pastor gives us the greater context of his passage that he's focusing on. When Nebuchadnezzar invaded the land of Judea and brought upon it such devastations and miseries, it was governed by a king who shared in the captivity of his subjects and was led with them by the conqueror in chains to Babylon. But in the happy restoration promised in our text, it is observable that the royal part of their government was not to be renewed. No mention is made in this refreshing prediction of a king, but only of nobles. Right? So you remember the history of Israel, right? The Hebrew Republic, as we call it, is that essentially that period of the judges, right? Up until the time of Samuel, the people demand a king like the nations around them. And God has to tell Samuel, don't be sad, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And so they get the king, Saul, which turned out to be a complete mess for them. Saul was not a good king. But God, in his providence and his mercy, brings David to be king, right? And he is a king after God's own heart, and he lifts the nation from the morass it had fallen into under Saul. Following David, you have Solomon, who begins as a great king and then loses his way, it seems. And in fact, things under Solomon get so frustrating for the people at the end that you essentially have a tax revolt and you end up with the split kingdom. And interestingly enough, the in that tax revolt, the northern kingdom was probably right in how they were approaching the taxes there. But of course, they turned out to be a very wicked kingdom. Um, right. So now this is interesting here because now we're at this point of the promise of being restored. And as our pastor is mentioning here, the prediction is not that there will be another king for them. There will be nobles, men of principal character and influence, who were to be of themselves, and such as they would choose to conduct their affairs, and a governor who should also proceed from the midst of them and preside over all, clothed with a tempered authority and dignity, not with an arbitrary power and the means of gratifying an unbounded avarice and ambition. It's as though God in his providence has brought the Israelites to this point, or the Jews, I guess, to this point. Okay, now you understand what happens when you put all your trust in an earthly king. Okay, it becomes a mess. And so, what we're going to do here, Jews, is we're going to restore things, but no king. No king for you now. No king. Um, you'll have nobles that govern, and you'll have a governor, certainly not a king. All right. Now, I know that there will be those who view this and think, what in the world are you talking about? This Hebrew Republic or whatever. What are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about this. The form of government originally established in the Hebrew nation by a charter from heaven was that of a free republic over which God himself, in peculiar favor to that people, was pleased to preside. Huh, huh. What are you talking about, Pastor? Are you talking about a Hebrew republic? Is that what you're talking about? And what was its basis? What was its foundation? What was its charter? It was a charter from heaven. I wonder what that could have been. What could that charter from heaven have been? Huh. It consisted of three parts. One, a chief magistrate who was called judge or leader, such as Joshua and others. Two, a council of 70 chosen men. And three, the general assemblies of the people. Of these, the two last were the most essential and permanent, and the first more occasional according to the particular circumstances of the nation. Their council or Sanhedrin remained with but little suspension, though all the vicissitudes they experienced till after the commencement of the Christian era. And so, and as to the assemblies of the people, that they were frequently held by divine appointment and considered as the fountain of civil power, which they exerted by their own decrees or distributed into various channels as they judged most conducive to their own security, order, and happiness, is evident beyond contradiction from the sacred history. Even the law of Moses, though framed by God himself, was not was not imposed upon that people against their will. It was laid open before the whole congregation of Israel. They freely adopted it, and it became their law, not only by divine appointment, but by their own voluntary and express consent. Upon this account, it is called in the sacred writings a covenant, compact, or mutual stipulation. Okay, so this idea of covenant runs deep in colonial history and in American history. um, I don't even know if you can get this book anymore, but there's a book out there called not the that's not what it's called. It's called A Covenanted People. A fascinating read in which the authors um, decided to search through from colonial time, I think up through the Constitution that we now live under, to try to figure out what was the key element. Like if you could identify one theme that runs through all of those documents, um, what would it be? And by the author's own admission, I think, if I remember correctly, by their own admission, um, they were surprised at what they came to conclude. And what they came to conclude was it was the theme of covenant. Covenant was the um, theme of continuity that ran through all of those governmental documents from the earliest colonial times up through the Constitution. Um, and um, fascinating. So let me show you this. So there's this website called archive.org, and they apparently have that book, A Covenanted People, available there to view as a PDF. This is it right here. Wow, I did not know that. A Covenanted People, the Religious Tradition and the Origins of American Constitutionalism. Fascinating. This might have to go on my stack of stuff to maybe be a part of midweek study to read through this. Fascinating. Okay. Um, all right. So look, this paragraph right here, if you were like not believing me, like, oh, this guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about or what he's saying. I'm telling you, it's being confirmed right here that when the founding father generation thought about, okay, where can we find the best principles of government? Unsurprisingly, as it should be to us, they realize, maybe what we should really focus on is looking how God went about building a nation, right? God engaged in nation building, and maybe we should pay attention to that, right? Like, there's been a lot of nations built through history. Maybe we should pay attention to the one that God built, and maybe that would be a good plan for us. A solemn, by the way, I would also say that this reaffirms or further affirms or more firmly establishes the recognition that, I mean, this is a Christian nation. I mean, what was this here? The religious tradition and the origins of American constitutionalism. You see that? Like, a solemn renewal of this covenant was the very last public act of Joshua, their renowned leader. He gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel and for the heads and for the judges and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. The occasion was great and important, being nothing less than to renew their acceptance of the Constitution they had received from heaven, and solemnly to confirm the national compact. How august was this assembly of a great nation, its representatives and magistrates of every order, with their brave and faithful leader at their head. He who had been foremost to face the dangers of their cause, who had fought so many battles for their happy settlement, and rendered such various and important services to his country. In short, but nervous and pathetic address to the assembly, he reminded them of their small original, of the peculiar favors granted by heaven to their progenitors, of their remarkable deliverance from the slavery of Egypt, of the wonders wrought for them by a divine hand in their progress through the wilderness, in their conquests on the borders of Canaan, and their firm possession of that promised land. Deeply impressed with this interesting collection, he warmly declares his own resolution to abide by that noble cause for which they had been led by heaven from an ignominious and servile dependence and formed into a distinct and respectable nation. But as the memorable act of the day depended entirely on the consent of the people, he accordingly refers the matter to their own free determination. Choose you this day whom you will serve. It was impossible for the people not to be moved by such an address, not to discern the excellency of the Mosaic constitutions, how well they were adapted to the particular circumstances of the nation and the noble purposes they were designed to promote. The people replied, "The Lord our God we will serve. We consent and are determined to be governed by the laws and the statutes he has been so graciously pleased to afford us." Then Joshua said unto the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him." And they said, "We are witnesses." If ever we renounce the constitution and happy settlement granted to us by heaven, if ever we break the sacred compact this day, and all the public and voluntary transactions of it must be a witness against us. Thus Joshua made a covenant with the people at Shechem, which we are afterwards told he recorded in a book, and at the same time erected a monumental stone upon the spot as a memorial of these sacred stipulations and as a perpetual testimony that the supreme ruler himself had not established their polity without their own free concurrence, and that the Hebrew nation, lately redeemed from tyranny, had now a civil and religious constitution of their own choice and were governed by laws to which they had given their solemn consent. Okay, so our pastor has rehearsed the history of the way in which the Hebrew Republic was built as a nation. Okay. But remember, this sermon, he prefaced this with, I'm astonished at the similarities between ancient Israel and what we here in these States United have gone through. I'm just astonished at that similarity. Okay. I don't think he's going to drop that idea, that concept. Okay. Now, he's very much gone into uh, focusing on the history of ancient Israel, right? He started with that fuller context of the passage in Jeremiah, the verses that are his specific text for his sermon. And he has pointed out, I would say rightly, that in the promise of this restoration, it's not a king, it's a governor, right? And I think it's the terms are significantly different, right? And from that, he then went back to, well, how did this whole thing get started? This thing that we call the Hebrew Republic. How did this whole thing get started? And he points out that here is God delivering his constitution for the people from heaven, and yet it is set before them for them to give their voice of consent to. All right, let's see where it goes from here. To mention all the passages in sacred writ which prove that the Hebrew government, though a theocracy, was yet as to the outward part of it a free republic. Right? So the Hebrew government, a theocracy, yet as to the outward part of it a free republic, and that the sovereignty resided in the people would be to recite a large part of its history. I will therefore only add a single instance. All right. When the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh had erected a separate altar, though it afterwards appeared with no bad intention, all the other tribes were extremely alarmed, and being met in general assembly, determined to make war on their offending brethren. But previous to the intended assault, they agreed to send an embassy to expostulate with them on the occasion. Phinehas and 10 princes, or principal men, were appointed for this purpose. Here was an act of sovereignty, and an act of the highest importance to the interest of any nation, involving in it nothing less than the power of making peace or war. It was not done by Joshua, though he was then alive. It was an act of the congregation of Israel. The embassy upon this momentous master was chosen, commissioned, and instructed by them. As it was democratically sent, says a great author who wrote conclusively, who fought bravely and died gloriously in the cause of liberty, it was democratically received. It was not directed to one man, but to all the children of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, and the answer was sent by them all. The report was made to the congregation, who finally determined the grand question and decided for peace. Okay, so that's our pastor's one instance. Now, he says that, the history is filled with instances that would prove what he is saying here. That's his one instance to demonstrate that this Hebrew republic, though a theocracy, still a free republic, and sovereignty resided in the people. And he uses this instance as his example of that. All right. Such was the civil constitution of the Hebrew nation. Till growing weary of the gift of heaven, they demanded a king. After being admonished by the prophet Samuel of the ingratitude and folly of their request, they were punished in the grant of it. Impiety, corruption, and disorder of every kind afterwards increasing among them, they grew ripe for the judgments of heaven in their desolation and captivity. Taught by these judgments the value of those blessings they had before despised, and groaning under the hand of tyranny more heavy than that of death, they felt the worth of their former civil and religious privileges, and were prepared to receive with gratitude and joy a restoration not barely to the land flowing with milk and honey, but to the most precious advantage they ever enjoyed in that land, their original constitution of government. They were prepared to welcome with the voice of mirth and thanksgiving the reestablishment of their congregations, nobles chosen from among themselves, and a governor proceeding from the midst of them. All right, so God builds the nation, the people consent to it, they've got their Hebrew republic. The gift of heaven is how our pastor describes that. They grow weary of it, they demand a king, it all goes wrong, right? They lose it all, they're in captivity, and then the promise of restoration comes to them, and in that promise, God says to them, oh, and by the way, I'm going to give you back your original constitution, right? You're not going back to a king to oppress you, right? You're going back to that original constitution, nobles chosen from among yourselves, a governor that comes from the midst of you. Such a constitution, twice established by the hand of heaven in that nation, so far as it respects civil and religious liberty in general, ought to be regarded as a solemn recognition from the supreme ruler himself of the rights of human nature, abstracted from those appendages and formalities which were peculiar to the Jews, and designed to answer some particular purposes of divine providence. It points out in general what kind of government infinite wisdom and goodness would establish among mankind. Do you see that? Do you see what the founding generation had concluded? Right? They acknowledge that, right, that there are um, things peculiar to this nation that God was building that don't apply, right? But in the main, in the general, it's right here for us. The kind of government that if we could bring in someone who has infinite wisdom and goodness, who's filled with infinite wisdom and goodness, this is what they would just say. It's this government right here. How do we know? Well, because the one being that exists who has infinite wisdom and goodness, that's what he did in building a nation. All right, so we're this far into the sermon, a sermon specifically considering matters of civil and religious liberty. Rome, Greece, nowhere. Not mentioned at all. We want not, indeed, a special revelation from heaven to teach us that men are born equal and free, that no man has a natural claim of dominion over his neighbors, nor one nation any such claim upon another, and that as government is only the administration of the affairs of a number of men combined for their own security and happiness, such a society have a right freely to determine by whom and in what manner their own affairs shall be administered. These are the plain dictates of that reason and common sense with which the common parent of men has informed the human bosom. It is, however, a satisfaction to observe such everlasting maxims of equity confirmed and impressed upon the consciences of men by the instructions, precepts, and examples given us in the sacred oracles. One internal mark of their divine original, and that they come from him who has made of one blood all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth, whose authority sanctifies only those governments that instead of oppressing any part of his family, vindicate the oppressed and restrain and punish the oppressor. All right, so in this paragraph, it seems that our pastor is saying, you might say, natural revelation is enough to tell us that a group of people should be able to govern themselves in the way in which they would choose to govern. And they shouldn't be overrun by another group of people that oppress, right? And impose. But then he's grateful that in the sacred oracles, that is the Bible, we have such clear instruction in his mind, such clear instruction. And this could be worthy of some thinking right here, because he's talking about that these instructions in Scripture come from God himself, whose authority sanctifies only those governments that instead of oppressing any part of his family, vindicate the oppressed and restrain and punish the oppressor. We probably don't think seriously enough about Christians who are terribly persecuted, even murdered in some of the countries around the world. And we need to pray for them, and pray that Christians hold firm to their faith. And I mean, we don't want them to waver. We don't want them to deny, certainly. We certainly don't want them murdered, right? So we need to pray for them. They would be strengthened greatly by the Holy Spirit in their trials. But if our pastor is right, those people who have rule in those countries and are um, oppressing God's family, we should shudder to think what that will look like when God's wrath comes against them for what they've done. All right, maybe one more paragraph here. Maybe, maybe two more. We'll see. Unhappy the people who are destitute of the blessing promised in our text, who have not the ulterior powers of government within themselves, who depend upon the will of another state with which they are not incorporated as a vital part, the interest of which must in many respects be opposite to their own, and who at the same time have no fixed constitutional barrier to restrain this reigning power. Okay, that I think gives some insight into the minds of the colonists with what they were dealing with, right? When he describes them, the circumstance as, people who are stuck in a position of depending upon the will of another state with which they are not incorporated as a vital part. Okay. Think about the phrase no taxation without representation, right? For these colonists, their royal charters um, gave them the freedom to be self-governed. Self-governed without, they couldn't violate ultimately the king's rule, right? But self-governed in terms of how are we going to organize here in our colony, right? Are we going to set up a school zone and have a reduced speed limit, whatever the local concerns might be? Yeah, many of them, maybe most of them, had governors appointed by the king, but that was to deal with the big issues, the issues that were connected the colonies to Great Britain itself, but otherwise self-governed. And then um, these colonists are abused by acts of parliament in which they have no direct representation. And this is their dilemma. They're stuck depending upon the will of another state, but they're not incorporated as a vital part of that. There's no meanness or misery to which such a people is not liable. There's not a single blessing, though perhaps indulged to them for a while, that they can call their own. There's nothing they have not to dread. Whether the governing power be itself free or despotic, it matters not to the poor dependent, right? Look, he's describing the circumstance that, his audience has recently struggled through. Nations who are jealous of their own liberties often sport with those of others. Nay, it has been remarked that the dependent provinces of free states have enjoyed less freedom than those belonging to despotic powers. Right? He's describing what the colonies have been experiencing prior to their Declaration of Independence. But here they are, dependent provinces of the Free State of Great Britain, and yet they have less freedom than those who live under despotic rulers. In fact, he says it here. Such was our late dismal situation, from which heaven has redeemed us by a signal and glorious revolution. We thought indeed we had a charter to support our rights, but we found a written charter a thin barrier against all prevailing power that could construe it to its own purpose or rescind it by the sword at its own pleasure. Yeah, reality was quite different than what they had thought. All right, we're going to do one more paragraph. Upon our present independence, sweet and valuable as the blessing is, we may read the inscription, I am found of them that sought me not. Be it to our praise or blame, we cannot deny that when we were not searching for it, it happily found us. This is so fascinating, right? Because I mean, like we're getting a glimpse into the mind of someone who's, well, he's at least 24 years old. I assume he was born before 1756, right? That's the first sermon we read. He's now 24 years older. We cannot deny that when we were not searching for it, independence, it happily found us. It certainly must have been not only innocent, but laudable and manly to have desired it even before we felt the absolute necessity of it. It was our birthright. We ought to have valued it highly and never to have received a mess of pottage, a small temporary supply, as an equivalent for it. You know what he's referring to here, right? He's referring to the Jacob and Esau, right? Esau, who sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. Going upon the trite metaphor of a mother country, which has so often been weakly urged against us. Like a child grown to maturity, we had a right to a distinct settlement in the world and to the fruits of our own industry. Let's not miss that. To the fruits of our own industry, right? That is so critical. When you end up with a government that deprives its people the enjoyment of the fruits of their own industry, things are heading in a dangerous direction. And it would have been but justice and no great generosity in her who so much boasted her maternal tenderness to us, had she not only readily acquiesced, but even aided us in this settlement. It is certain, however, that we did not seek an independence, and it is equally certain that Britain, though she meant to oppose it with all her power, has by a strange infatuation taken the most direct and perhaps the only methods that could have established it. This is just fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, the understanding of what was going on. He's saying we weren't seeking independence, and you can, I think you can confirm this as you look at the history leading up to that declaration and the continuous efforts by the colonists to call upon the mother country for their rights as men, as Englishmen, and as Christians to be respected, to be upheld, to be secured. They wanted to be the king's people. So they were not seeking an independence. It is equally certain that now, Britain, though she meant to oppose independence with all her power, has by a strange infatuation taken the most direct and perhaps the only methods that could have established it. Right? So this is him seeing in the designs of men the hand of Providence truly directing. A people who were not seeking independence, and independence found them, and a nation, a government that was seeking to crush ideas of independence, and yet by their actions established it. Her oppressions, her unrelenting cruelty have driven us out from the family of which we were once a part. This has opened our eyes to discern the inestimable blessing of a separation from her. While, like children that have been inhumanely treated and cast out by their parents, and at the same time are capable of taking care of themselves, we have found friendship and respect from the world and have formed new, advantageous, and honorable connections. Okay, that paragraph is amazing to gain, I think, some really fascinating insight into what was going on in the minds of the colonists. And our pastor is like, not sure this is a good thing or a bad thing for us, but we can't deny we weren't searching for independence, but independence happily found us. And so you see how he characterizes this, and I'm presuming that look, this is a guy who's 24 years older from 1756. Maybe I should let's figure out here. Rev Samuel Cooper, Massachusetts, birth and death dates. Let's get clarity here. Born 1725, died 1783. So he's 3 years from his death. So in 1780, if my math serves, he's 55. So in 1756, he was only 31 years old when we preached that sermon that we read first. Um, Interesting. Right, but I mean, look, at the time of the revolution, 1776, right? He's 51 years old. Um, right, so he has a keen awareness of what was happening. In fact, we come to find out that, well, as the interwebs tell me here, he was a key patriot figure, friend to leaders like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, and chaplain to the Massachusetts General Court. In fact, I think he was actually involved pretty seriously with the framing of the Massachusetts Constitution, if I remember correctly. But I just think it's fascinating insight. I mean, I don't know. I'm gonna have to talk to the guy that does that history done right and let him know that we have some primary source information here about what was really in the minds of the colonists, how they were thinking about this, right? And how they looked to the king, Great Britain, as their mother country. But it came to this point where they were being cast out by mom. But fortunately, they recognized, oh, we can take care of ourselves. We don't have to live in mom's basement anymore. We can make it on our own. And that's independence. Fascinating insight from that. Okay, I've gone long enough. We are about 6 pages into um, this election sermon from 1780, and we've just witnessed a wonderful retelling of the history of the Hebrew Republic. We've confirmed that that's the way the founding generation thought about the ancient government of Israel as a free republic, and that's what they valued in terms of evaluating what makes sense for government. And that evaluation of things is something that had been happening rigorously in all these years leading up to the War for Independence. Um, their governmental thinking was being shaped by pastors like this, who saw in ancient Israel a free republican government. And when I say republican, I don't mean political party. I mean the form of the government is a republic, representative, right? A republic that first values law, right? That's the highest ruler is law, and then law rightly is that which conforms to God's will, right? God's law. Um, and then in the administration of that law, values um, separated powers, representatives, men of good character to conduct those offices. Okay, so we'll stop there for tonight. Hope that was both helpful and meaningful to you. We'll continue with this next week. That'll be the plan, to continue with this next week, um, as we, well, read this fascinating sermon plus history of our own nation, right? Fascinating. So please do the whole YouTube thing. Do a like, do a subscribe, share the video, right? Let's start drawing other people more aggressively into what it is that we're doing. Um, I can't say for certain. I'm sure there's tons of quality and good YouTubers out there, certainly more professional YouTubers than anything we're doing. But um, as far as content, the importance of content, I'm not sure you're going to find anything that beats what we're doing here through the course of the week, right? Our Monday's History Done Right, our Tuesday, um, Lantern's Quest. If you didn't get a chance to view last night's podcast, I think you need to. I think it was one of the best discussions we've had, and we've had some really good discussions. I mean, the things that Pastor Lucas and Pastor David are able to bring out and emphasize, so valuable. Our Wednesday night midweek study, and then Friday our random cast. Um, yeah, be a part, but don't just you be a part. Be a part by helping encourage others to be a part as well. And let's see where we can take this. All right. So thanks for viewing this video, and know that we'll continue with this sermon. And so next Wednesday, we'll continue with our 1780 election sermon and see where Samuel Cooper takes us. So you all have a good night, good rest of your week. Friday, the random cast. Next Monday, we start them all over again with History Done Right. Please join us as you are able.